Hi, everybody, and welcome to another week. We're going to do civil rights and feminism this week. And we want to start by saying that the roots of the civil rights movement in the United States and in Britain do go kind of hand in hand with the anti-colonialism and the freedom movements in Africa that we talked about at length a couple of weeks ago. There are the roots of this whole process of civil rights, the civil rights movement in the United States and sort of in Britain. That's where they start, but there are consequences for this everywhere. So this does extend beyond just the United States and Great Britain. So, like we said, that it does go kind of hand in hand with the anti-colonialism movements that we talked about, but this is sort of a very unique situation, a unique process. So the Black Freedom Movement in the United States does start as far back as the late 19th century with the 13th Amendment, which of course frees all slaves, outlaws slavery in the United States, and it extends with the 14th and the 15th Amendments. And the 14th Amendment, just to kind of rehash that, is this, it's about citizenship. It extends citizenship rights to all former slaves, both men and women, just to ensure that they all have the same citizenship rights as do white people in the United States. And the 15th Amendment is the Voting Rights Amendment. It grants the vote to all African and former slaves, all former slaves who are African American in the United States, and even those who weren't former slaves. There are some in the North who were never slaves, but just not as many. And the thing about that, though, is that it is a very long process before those are actually uh, listened to, before the state governments actually start listening to these amendments. It's about 100 years, almost exactly, before everybody recognizes the 14th and the 15th Amendments. It's not until 1964 and 1965 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act under Lyndon Johnson, who we don't really cover that much in this class, that it finally gets to where it needs to be before these two amendments are finally actually enforced. The state governments had figured out ways to get around them, especially with things like separate but equal. If you think about separate but equal, meaning in the South, almost exclusively, that black and white children didn't have to go to the same schools as long as African American children had their own schools that were supposed to be equal to Southern white schools. But of course, when we found out, once we get to the Brown decision here in a second, we're going to find out that separate but equal is inherently unequal. That is the decision handed down by the Supreme Court. So that's the next one that we're going to move to here, Brown versus the Board of Education. It's a Supreme Court case. It's actually a number of court cases, but Brown, it's not even alphabetically the first that was part of that whole court case, but it's second. But that's the one that we know it as. So there's actually 5 cases in there, which I found was remarkable when I first learned about it. But the Brown versus Board of Education finally declares segregation inherently unequal, which it was. It came, I should say, it was in education that the first sort of broad movements of the civil rights movements took place, because education was the easiest one for African American groups to tackle, because it was pretty obvious that African American schools were not equal to white schools, especially in the South. Um, they're obviously inferior. We can go back and look at the pictures, African American schools versus white schools, and it's not to disparage most places in the South, but Southern schools couldn't afford necessarily to educate white children, let alone 2 separate schools for white and black children. Uh, the NAACP, and just to put a little story on this one there, NAACP is what it is. So we say NAACP, and I have to qualify that. So I was teaching a class a long time ago, and one of my students, she wrote the end of Lacey Pete on the test, because I guess that's what she heard me saying. So I couldn't really mark it wrong. I just had to correct it later. So just be aware, NAACP, the NAACP is what we're talking about there. They go after graduate schools in the South originally because there are so few graduate schools in the South as it was. So there are white graduate schools and black graduate schools as segregation had existed, but they were clearly inferior. African American schools were clearly inferior, so it was very easy for the NAACP and other civil rights organizations to go after these places. The whole civil rights movement was pretty much a grassroots organization, grassroots movement all over the South and in the North. It was made up of a series of diverse local movements. It wasn't just Martin Luther King and the NAACP who were taking on these issues. There was a bunch of grassroots local organizations who were dealing with these issues, and the tactics varied from side to side, from place to place. You had a lot of nonviolent uh, organizing, which is best exemplified by Martin Luther King, but there are also cases of what's known as armed self-defense, and we'll talk about an example here in a second. But the first one we're going to go over are the first example after the Brown decision of where the civil rights movement was moving next, and we're going to go to Montgomery, Alabama, and Rosa Parks. Now, the thing to know about Rosa Parks is that she wasn't just some random old lady who didn't want to give up her seat on the bus. She was chosen by the movements because, or for a couple of reasons, but she had been an active organizer for a couple of years before the Montgomery bus boycotts actually get going. Martin Luther King, for his part, though, at this point during the Rosa Parks situation, was something of a newcomer. We have some images here. So there's Martin Luther King up in the top left and Rosa Parks in the bottom left. And I can't emphasize enough that Rosa Parks, she was already an activist. She wanted things to change. So she was the person to do it, right? There was other cases that could have been other people who could have been the first sort of national face to the movement. Rosa Parks was chosen because she was, by all accounts, a nice old lady. Looks like a nice old lady. Other people that could have done it. There was one particular young lady who could have, but she was actually an unwed, pregnant or single mother, so she wasn't exactly who they wanted to be the face of the movement. So anyway, there's a long way to say that Rosa Parks was already involved in the civil rights movements before the Montgomery bus boycotts began. So I think we know the story of that pretty well. Most of us should have taken U.S. history by this point, but if you haven't, I encourage you to take U.S. history here. You can go over it in much more depth. So the bus boycotts last a rather long time, and it's African Americans around the city refusing to ride the city buses until they desegregated, and it actually hurts the bus company to a large degree because they needed African Americans to ride their buses to actually keep them running. And so that's sort of the nonviolent approach, are things like boycotts led by Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. And then on the other hand, we have something of a local boy. His name is Robert Williams. He's from Monroe, North Carolina, and his strategy was armed self-defense. He had been a a veteran. He was a veteran, and he decided that in order to meet the white violence that was happening to African Americans themselves should take up arms only in self-defense. Though he was the head of the Robert Williams was the head of the NAACP chapter in Monroe. And the situation in Monroe was that African Americans couldn't use the public swimming pool, so Robert Williams organized protests against that. And what happened was the local KKK fired shots at them, like with weapons. So they decided to take up arms. He had been a World War II veteran, so he was trained on how to use weapons, even though in World War II, African American soldiers in the U.S. Army weren't allowed to do much of the fighting at all. For a little while, he ended up going into exile in Cuba, of all places, and that was right around the time of the Cuban Revolution issues, so he kind of got labeled a communist a little bit later in life. There is some parallel here to South Africa we talked about Nelson Mandela, and when he ended up giving up nonviolence when he figured out that it wasn't working. So these are kind of the two big approaches here: armed self-defense versus nonviolence organizing. Now, the whole civil rights movement really peaks in 1963 when we finally get the march, the Million Man March, as it was, in Washington, D.C. And here's the Washington picture in the top left of the Washington Monument with roughly 1 million people surrounding it. That's the reflecting pool, and then it's sort of a picture out from the Lincoln Memorial, and you can see in the background there, I'll just highlight it here, that's the Capitol right there. And I do believe that in our scale here, the White House would be over here somewhere, unless it's on the other side. I don't have a very good sense of direction when I'm not there. So anyway, that's sort of the culmination of the civil rights movement to this point. And this almost directly, along with a bunch of other protests around the country, leads to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally enforced the 14th and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution, finally giving them teeth to power the federal government to do something about it. And we have a picture on the bottom right here of Lyndon Johnson, the Southern Democratic leader from Texas. He takes over after Kennedy was assassinated, and he's reelected once. So Lyndon Johnson does a whole heck of a lot for the civil rights movement. There's actually a really good new movie on HBO. It's got Bryan Cranston playing LBJ. I forget the name of it now, actually. I shouldn't have said anything. Maybe All the Way or Lead the Way or something. But it's a really good movie. I watched it last year. It sort of surrounds this whole process of the civil rights and the voting rights acts. Now, the successes of the civil rights movement, actually the process of the civil rights movement, is directly linked to the changes associated with World War II and the post-war world. In World War II, the United States fights for democracy against Adolf Hitler, right, the ultimate racist who's responsible for the deaths of up to 11 million ethnic minorities. And African Americans, for their part, fought a double-sided campaign, what they called the Double V campaign. And you hold up, two fingers on both your hands. Double V means victory at home and victory abroad for the African American, for the civil rights movements. So that was a big one. African Americans weren't willing to go back to racism in large part after World War II, like what sort of happened after World War One. After they fight for democracy and freedom abroad, they want it at home too. There's also this post-war economic boom, which is people are becoming more affluent. African Americans want to participate in this affluence. We talked at great length about the affluence after the war that came to white people, so African Americans want to experience that too. TV plays an important role because for the first time people are seeing images of what's going on in the South. Northerners are seeing images of what's going on in the South. Southerners had been familiar with it, but you think back to the images of police dogs chasing down African American protesters, or the fire department opening up the fire hydrants and spraying the African American protesters with these high-powered hoses. So TV does have a noticeable effect on the outcome of the civil rights movement because people in the North are seeing how horrible it actually is. And the Cold War, specifically with the connections to the decolonization process in Africa, does play a large part here. And we have some images on the next screen here. I want to show you this image on the bottom. That's actually a Chinese propaganda poster where they depict African Americans alongside Chinese people fighting for freedom. So that's a Chinese propaganda poster. And remember, this bipolar world that exists as part of the Cold War is a huge deal. And if you have China making fun of the United States or pointing out the inherent inequality in the United States, then it's really time to change something. And I have some other images up top. That's President Nixon. Is before he's president. That's actually Vice President Nixon, I think, when he was vice president under Eisenhower, meeting with Martin Luther King, or shortly after he was vice president, because there's this interim period where he's not in the federal part of the executive branch for a couple of years when Kennedy and Johnson are there. And at the top right, that's an image from the South, sort of characteristic of what's happening all over the South, where white people just don't want African Americans to go to school together. And we can say it all goes back to kind of this fear of mixing the races. White people do not want black boys, especially, attending school with their children because, in large parts, part of the propaganda after the Civil War for many years is that of the African American, the young African American man as sort of a sex-crazed maniac, thinking that if they allowed them to go to school together, that it would just lead to African Americans and white girls having children together. You don't hear much about white boys getting together with African American girls because it was expected, I guess, not to happen. But if you really want to get into this, there are courses offered here about racial issues in American history, and you can learn about how white men would use rape against black women as a source of power. So it's a huge problem across the South, but I encourage you to take another course where you can get way more in depth on that here at the university. And so that was and what I should say about before I move on, the poster down at the bottom there, the Chinese are actually pretty racist at this point too. So it is a little bit misleading, but in their propaganda, they like to say that they're not. But now, so that's what I want to say about the civil rights movement. That was it in 15 minutes, um, and we just sort of glossed all over it. I hope that's satisfactory. But if you want to go more in depth into it, we can talk about it on one of the discussion threads in Canvas. Now, moving on to feminism around the world, we also want to notice that women's rights movements date back to the 19th century as well. Uh, the first part, there's actually, if you look at history, they split up the women's movement into different categories. The first women's movement was really about securing the right to vote. So in 1919, the United States finally passes the 19th Amendment, known as, or it's the women's rights, or the right to vote for women's amendment. The United States was not the first Western nation to do this, and I wish we were in a class so I could quiz you or just kind of give you some trivia, but New Zealand is actually the first to extend the right to vote to all women as far back as 1893. And that's not to say that certain states didn't have uh, voting rights for women, but on the national level, it wasn't granted universally until 1919. There's actually female members of the House of Representatives before women had the right to vote, which is kind of remarkable to me. But for what we're talking about here, the women's rights movement, the second part is that really gets going in the 1960s. Uh, for a long time, women are not expected to get a higher education or work after they get married. But after what had happened in World War I and World War II, those expectations were sort of changing, at least in the eyes of women. During the 1950s, sort of this image of women being or going back to the kitchen more or less, and all of the advertisements were surrounded about or were about women getting nice stoves or nice aprons for their kitchens. So that kind of was the expectation, but women weren't satisfied with that anymore. Excuse me. Single women were expected to either teach, be a nurse, be a secretary, but once you got married, you were supposed to quit and just be a housewife and mother for the rest of your life. One major disappointment of the civil rights movement is that it did not include uh, civil rights for women too. A lot of women participated in the civil rights movement thinking that that would mean equal rights for women as well, and that doesn't actually happen. So we get this new movement, the women's movement emerges out of that, due mostly to the disappointments of the civil rights movement. Another problem was that the post-war American economy and Western economies in general required two incomes per household to actually afford to live in it. I said post-war economy plus consumerism, the developing consumerism, require two incomes per household to actively participate in it. But that was one of those disconnections between expectations and reality because women weren't expected to work. So where was the other income supposed to come from? The answer is there wasn't one. So women did have to work in many cases. So some organizations developed to fight this. The first one that we're going to talk about here is the National Organization for Women, acronymed NOW, and these are mostly college women. They work through the courts, they lobby Congress, they go through traditional routes to try and fix the problems fix women's problems. There are other more direct organizations that do develop during this time frame too. Part of that is participating in less than, I guess, traditional methods of getting things changed in the United States, where one of these direct organizations put on the Miss America cattle auction, and this fake cattle auction was meant quite explicitly to call out the sort of the dehumanization, excuse me, of judging women by their looks that happens in things like the Miss America pageants. So these are one of the sort of the direct actions against the dehumanizing of women. The first big step in women's liberation at this time in the 1960s was the introduction of the birth control pill. Contraception in many states was illegal through the 1960s, but the birth control pill really revolutionizes what's allowed and what's not allowed. Women, for the first time, were finally in control of their reproductive cycles, right? Like, so in the before time, it was sort of up to a man whether or not he had a condom or not. But now women, for the first time, have access to the birth control pill in the 1960s, and that's sort of the revolutionary, like the changing moments is access to the birth control pill, where women can take control of their own bodies. So to talk about the impact on American society from this second part of the civil rights, not the women's rights movement here, is we'll talk about the Equal Rights Amendments. So the Equal Rights Amendments is proposed, and it actually doesn't pass. And if we were in a regular class where I could give you multiple guesses on the exam, I would say something like, "When did the Equal Rights Amendment pass?" And I could tell who's paying attention, who's not paying attention, because there is no Equal Rights Amendments. There's actually some reactions from both sides. People or women are afraid that if Equal Rights Amendment passes, what else is going on in the 1960s and early 1970s? The Vietnam War, and American men are being drafted into war. So one fear is that women will be drafted into war, right? So that's just one side of it. So there's, we can debate what the good or bad issues from the Equal Rights Amendment that actually never passes. And the next big impact here is a Supreme Court decision in 1973, Roe versus Wade. And this is something that you hear a lot about in the news today. Our current president has talked about it ad nauseum, right? And the most recent, who was he confirmed today? Yeah, it had to been today. Neil Gorsuch said that this is the law, so he's not going to overturn it. But a lot of Republicans do want to overturn Roe versus Wade. But this is the one that makes abortion legal in the United States. Beforehand, it was up to the states, and most states had it illegal. So there was a lot of back alley abortions that would take place, and a lot of women suffered because of it. But this Supreme Court decision is a direct reflection of the women's movement, in sort of a response to the contraception, the access to contraception for women. So these are some of the big achievements here, or one of the big achievements is the Roe versus Wade decision. Not that you have to agree with its morality or not. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. And the Equal Rights Amendments actually never passes. So let's look at feminism worldwide. What's going on in the rest of the world outside of the United States? Now, in Western Europe and Australia, so other developed, industrialized nations, it's pretty similar pattern to the United States, because society is similar to the United States. There are educated populations. Australia and most places in Western Europe have similar programs to the GI Bill, and they have similar healthcare programs, or actually, in some cases, better healthcare programs. But consumerism is taken off in most of these places in Western Europe and Australia, most of these countries in Western Europe and Australia too. So it's a very similar path as to the United States here. But in the Soviet Union and communist Eastern Europe, in rhetoric, women are supposed to be equal to men. Every person is equal before the communist ideology. But in practice, that's not always the case, right? They're actually written into the Constitution. Equality is written into the constitutions of the Soviet Union and most of the satellite countries in Eastern Europe, but they don't totally live up to it, is what we want to stay there. There are state systems of childcare to allow women to work, but much like in sort of the old model of the way women were supposed to be, in air quotes, is that women were expected to go to work when there was childcare provided, but then they would have to come home and still make dinner and clean the kitchen and take care of the kids, while the father was not expected to do that. So that's kind of the situation that has always existed in what was Russia and Eastern Europe. In China, they're a little more egalitarian. Um, the revolution takes place, and there are communists after 1949. So in urban areas, the equality is a little bit more apparent. It's different in rural areas because they have always had to work. They're subsistence farmers in most places in China. Remember, we talked about those collective farms with 50,000 families where everybody has to work. So it is a little more egalitarian, but it's not perfect in China. In other places like India, they're kind of supposed to be egalitarian. For example, there are anti-dowry laws passed in as far back as 1961, or I guess as recently as 1961. But dowries continue to be a problem even today. The practice of sati was outlawed by the Indian governments when the British were still in charge there. But through the 20th century, women commit or practice sati, S-A-T-I, in case anybody's interested. But there's differences because India is one of the first major countries on earth to have female leader, this woman Indira Gandhi, who's not really related to that Gandhi, the one you're thinking of. She's actually related more closely to Nehru, who was their first prime minister of an independent India. But so they're the first ones, and she's prime minister twice in their system. I think we went over that when I shared that document about India with you. So they are a little ahead of the game in terms of having a female leader. A lot of countries are ahead of the United States uh, in terms of having a female leader. Pakistan, of all place, which used to be the same part of India, has also had a female leader. And so, it's varying degrees of what's going on and where, how the women's movement is going around the world. And we'll shift now to the Middle East and the Arab world. And we want to say that Israel, for their part, is ahead of the game. There's a tradition in the Arab world of patriarchy. And there's a debate in the Muslim world about whether or not this is from the Quran or just from a mullah. So that's kind of a ongoing problem in the Arab world right now, and I don't want to say the Muslim world because there's sort of secular Arabs who are involved in this too. So there are some reforms that take place around the Middle East, and today, I mean, it's sort of a very sticky situation even today. But in the Middle East, when we say Golda Meir, she was leader of Israel for a little while, so they are kind of ahead of the game in the Arab world there. Africa, for their parts, there are women involved in the anti-colonial campaigns in Africa, but they don't share power after liberation, kind of like women in the United States don't get what they want after the civil rights movement. Um, so there are problems everywhere, it would seem, during this women's rights movement time frame. And we do want to say that there is a connection between economic modernization and changes for women. The more economically modern a place is, the better off women probably are there. And you can take that however you want, but I think that you'll notice when you look at countries around the world, uh, the more economically well-off countries have better uh, rights for women, and that's not to say that everything's perfect. In the United States, there's still this huge pay gap for women in the workforce, which hopefully in the next few years will be taken care of when you guys are out going to get your jobs. Now, what we want to finish with here is by saying that the women's rights movement is an international issue by the mid-1970s. The UN designated 1975 as the International Women's Year. Uh, so that just sort of illustrates that it is sort of recognized as a worldwide issue in the mid-1970s. There are significant changes for women by the late 20th century, so right up to our period here where we're living currently. There's greater access to education and contraception than there ever had been before. And paid work outside of the household is more and more common, especially in the developed world, but it's happening in the less developed world too. And there is a growing separation of family life from the institution of marriage. And what that means is that women aren't always expected around the world to be the sole providers for the family like they had been for many hundred years, thousands of years actually. But that's sort of changing now. In some places, in other places, it's worse than it is like perhaps in the United States, depending on how you feel about it, what you consider equality or not. But anyway, that brings us to the end of our feminism portion here. So civil rights and feminism. If anybody has any questions about any of this, feel free to email me at any time, and I will see you guys next week. But I do want to say before we go here, I appreciate those of you who are watching this, and I can't offer 5 points every week. So look out for it in the future, though, because I am going to do it again, because I do know who's watching by now, and I really appreciate it, and I'm pretty confident that those of you who are paying attention are probably doing better in the class. Okay, so thanks, guys. Let me know if you have any questions.